The day Elias Colt buried his last reason to speak, he nailed the front door shut from the inside. That was 2 winters ago. He'd kept the ranch running, fed the horses, mended the fence, cooked the same grey meal every evening, not because he cared about living, but because stopping felt like a choice he hadn't earned the right to make. Then the blizzard came down from the mountains like God had something to say. And with it, a knock. Not the wind, a knock, 3 times, deliberate. He stood in the dark for a long moment, his hand flat against the wood, willing it to stop. It didn't. When he finally opened the door, the cold rushed in first, and then she did. Half frozen, carpetbag clutched to her chest, snow buried in her hair, eyes wide and searching his face like she recognized him. "Mr. Hargrove," she whispered. Elias hadn't heard another human voice in 41 days, and that wasn't even his name. Before we ride deeper into this tale, subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another journey through the dust, danger, and legends of the Wild West. Now, back to the trail. The day Elias Colt buried his last reason to speak, he nailed the front door shut from the inside. That was 2 winters ago. He'd kept the ranch running, fed the horses, mended the fence, cooked the same grey meal every evening, not because he cared about living, but because stopping felt like a choice he hadn't earned the right to make. Clara had wanted this land. She had pressed her hands into the soil the first spring they arrived and said it felt like something worth building. He owed it to her memory to keep it standing, even if he no longer stood fully inside it himself. His days had the shape of living without the weight of it. 4 in the morning, before the dark even thought about softening, boots on, hat on, out to the horses. He spoke to them sometimes, low and wordless, the way a man will talk to animals when he has forgotten how to talk to people. Then the fencing, then whatever needed mending. Then the grey meal, salt pork and cornmeal, the same as yesterday, the same as tomorrow, eaten standing at the stove, because sitting at the table for one felt like a cruelty he hadn't yet learned to absorb. Then silence. Then sleep. Then 4 o'clock again. Hank Deaver still rode out once a week. He was Elias' oldest friend, the kind of man who'd stood beside him at his wedding and held his arm at the burial and never once said anything as foolish as "it gets easier." Hank had stopped knocking on the front door 6 months ago, when it became clear the nailed boards weren't coming down for company. Now he left things by the barn, cornmeal, dried beans, once a jar of peach preserves that Elias suspected came from Hank's wife, and rode back without calling out. It was the most respectful thing anyone had ever done for him. In Coldwater Crossing, 2 miles east, people still remembered the man Elias Colt used to be. The one who laughed too loud at the feed store and danced badly but enthusiastically at every harvest social with Clara on his arm, her head tipped back, delighted. That man had been worth knowing. People spoke of him the way they spoke of the dead, past tense, fond, with a quiet ache underneath. Nobody said it out loud. They didn't have to. The blizzard came down from the mountains on a Thursday with no particular warning, the way catastrophe often does, unhurried, absolute, indifferent to the lives it was about to rearrange. Clara Mee Whitfield had been 3 days on the stage out of Missouri, her carpetbag on her lap and her hands folded over her worn Bible the way a woman holds onto the only reliable things she owns. She was 32 years old, practical in the way that poverty teaches, and possessed of a quiet dignity that had survived more cold welcomes than this one. She had answered a mail-order advertisement placed by a Mr. Thomas Hargrove, farmer, widower, Coldwater Crossing, Montana Territory, and had done so not out of desperation exactly, but out of the particular courage of a woman who understands that a fresh start requires movement. The stage driver, visibility gone to nothing, pulled up at the nearest structure with lamplight showing through the window, and told her this was the Hargrove property. It was not. When Elias opened the door, after the 3 knocks he'd stood motionless listening to, hand flat on the wood, willing them to stop, the cold entered first, as cold always does, and then she did. Half frozen, snow deep in her hair, eyes searching his face with an expression that sat somewhere between relief and uncertainty. "Mr. Hargrove," she whispered. Elias stared at her. That was not his name. He hadn't heard a human voice in 41 days, and the first one to reach him in all that silence had come attached to the wrong man entirely. He should have told her to get back on the stage. The stage was already gone. He should have pointed her down the road toward Hargrove's farm. The road was under 4 feet of snow and disappearing by the minute. There was nowhere to send her. There was nothing to do but the decent thing. He stepped aside. She came in. He didn't say a word. He gave her the small back room, the one whose door he hadn't opened since the autumn Clara died. It had been meant for the child. He didn't tell Clara me that. He just opened it, let the cold air out, and set a lamp inside without explanation. She asked no questions. He was grateful in a way he couldn't have named. The rules established themselves without discussion, the way rules do between 2 people who are both accustomed to managing alone. She ate at the table. He ate at the stove. She did not touch the small shelf near the window where Clara's things remained, the song book, the pressed flower, the photograph. She seemed to understand, by some instinct or perception he hadn't anticipated, that those things were not hers to disturb. He would ride to Hargrove's farm when the snow broke. Until then, they would simply occupy the same walls without incident. She had arrived with almost nothing: the carpet bag, the Bible, a second dress that she hung carefully on the peg behind the door. She carried herself without complaint, without performance, without the nervous chatter some women used to fill silence they found uncomfortable. She didn't seem to find his silence uncomfortable at all. That, more than anything, unsettled him. The first evening, when the meal was set and she sat down at the table alone, she bowed her head and murmured something soft, brief, genuinely meant. "A prayer of thanks," said quietly, like a woman who had gone hungry enough times that gratitude for a plate of food required no pretending. Elias heard it from across the room. He looked up from his bowl without meaning to. He looked back down before she raised her head. But for just one moment, the first in 2 winters, something in the room had felt like it was inhabited by more than grief. The blizzard did not break on the second day. Elias had checked the sky at 4 in the morning, the way he always did, stepping out the back door into the dark, reading the clouds, calculating. What he saw told him nothing was moving. The snow was still falling, patient and indifferent, and the road to Hargrove's farm was as gone as it had been the night before. He stood there a moment longer than necessary, breath rising white in the black air, then turned back inside. She was already awake. He could hear her moving in the kitchen, quiet, careful movements, the kind a person makes when they are trying not to disturb a household that isn't theirs. He pulled on his coat and went out to the barn without looking in, and he stayed there longer than the horses required, cleaning tack that was already clean, checking hooves he'd checked yesterday, giving himself the distance that had become his only reliable comfort. When he came back in, stamping snow off his boots at the back step, he stopped. The kitchen was different, not dramatically, not in the way of a woman who wanted to be noticed making changes. But the disorder he'd allowed to accumulate over 2 winters, the mismatched tins pushed to the back of the shelf, the skillet left on the wrong hook, the cornmeal sack open on the counter when it ought to have been tied and stored, All of it had been quietly corrected. The surface of the table was visible for the first time in months. And on it sat a plate, salt pork same as always, but there was also a pan of cornbread, properly made, cut into squares, still warm from the oven. A tin cup of coffee beside it, steam rising. Elias stood in the doorway for a moment. Clara Mee was at the far end of the kitchen with her back to him, wiping down the shelf where the tins now sat in order. She didn't turn around. She didn't announce what she'd done or invite praise for it. She simply continued working, as though setting a proper meal on a man's table was a thing that required no acknowledgement. He sat down, he ate,